Mom was finally getting better, which should have been great news. Except, better created a whole new problem. She still couldn't get out of bed. She still couldn't put weight on her broken leg. She wasn't ready for intensive rehab. But she was getting medically stable enough that we had to start figuring out where she was going next. And that's when caregiving took a turn I wasn't prepared for. I wasn't just trying to keep Mom alive anymore. I was trying to figure out how she was going to live. And not just her. Our whole future was starting to change. I just didn't know it yet. Welcome back to The Wicked Daughter. At that point, I was still focused on one day at a time. Was Mom breathing better? Was she doing her exercises? Was she getting stronger? Basically, I was still trying to get through Tuesday. Then the caseworker called. She wanted to schedule a care conference. Now, if you've never had a care conference, neither had I. I'd been told about it when Mom was transferred to the acute care hospital, but this was my first one. Apparently, everyone involved in your loved one's care gets together to review how they're doing, answer questions, and start talking about the next stage of care, which sounds very organized and reassuring until you realize the next stage might be coming a lot sooner than you thought. I'd already met most of the people who would be in the room. The nurses, the therapist, nutrition, the doctors, respiratory. So I figured, okay, we're going to sit down, talk about how Mom is doing, answer some questions, and figure out what she needs from here. No big deal. The day of the conference came. Everyone gathered. We started talking about Mom's progress. And then they started talking about discharge. Discharge. Mom had barely been there a week. She wasn't even out of bed yet. Are you kidding me? Except they weren't wrong. Medically, Mom was doing incredibly well. And this is one of those things I think caregivers need to hear. When you're in the middle of a medical crisis, your brain is focused on the next thing. Get through today. Get through the next procedure. Get through tonight. Get her breathing. Get her eating. Get her stronger. You're not necessarily thinking about what happens 3 weeks from now. The medical team is. And that's part of what I was learning. I was focused on getting Mom better. They were already thinking about what she'd need after she was better. And that's part of our job as caregivers, too. We don't have all the answers. God knows I didn't. But we have to start asking questions. What's the next step? What happens after this? What does Mom need next? What do I need to know? Because while I was focused on getting Mom through the day, I was beginning to realize that what happens next was now part of my job too. And that was a whole new skill set. Luckily, Mom was giving us some pretty good news to work with. Her lungs were improving. Her heart was stable. Her hematoma was shrinking. Her broken leg was healing. They were even starting to wean her off oxygen during the day. A few hours at a time. And it was going well. They'd keep the oxygen nearby, but unless her oxygen saturation dropped, she usually didn't need the nasal tube. At night, she still needed it. But even that was progress. And I was thrilled. Of course I was. After everything we'd been through, every improvement felt enormous. But here's the weird thing about caregiving. Someone can be doing incredibly well medically and still be nowhere near independent. You see, physically, Mom couldn't even get out of bed. She couldn't sit upright on her own. After everything she'd been through, her core muscles were incredibly weak. Before she could even think about getting in a chair, she had to be strong enough to sit up. And she still had at least another couple of weeks before she could put weight on the broken leg. Realistically, at 88 years old, it could be another 4 to 8 weeks. And then she'd need more rehab, probably weeks of it. So suddenly we weren't just asking, how do we get Mom better? We were asking, where does Mom go next? And if you're listening to this as a caregiver, you may know exactly what I'm talking about. Because there's this strange point where the emergency starts to fade. And somehow, the decisions get harder. During the crisis, somebody tells you what needs to happen. She needs surgery. She needs oxygen. She needs a ventilator. She needs ICU care. You don't have time to sit around figuring out the next 5 months. You just do the next thing. But then your parent gets better. And suddenly somebody asks, so what happens when she leaves here? And you're thinking, I don't know. I was busy keeping her alive. Nobody gives you a transition period. Nobody says, congratulations, the immediate crisis is over. Please take the next 48 hours to develop a comprehensive life plan for your aging parent. Nope. Apparently, you're just supposed to figure it out. Mom wasn't strong enough for a full-scale inpatient rehabilitation program yet. She couldn't tolerate hours of intense therapy every day. So we started looking at long-term care facilities that could continue caring for her medically while she got stronger. It wasn't where we wanted her to be. But at that point, I wasn't trying to figure out what we wanted. I was trying to figure out what was actually possible. And that distinction matters. Because sometimes caregiving means letting go of the option you hoped for and figuring out what the person in front of you actually needs. And that was becoming very clear. Mom might not be going back to living independently. And that realization hit hard. Until then, I'd been thinking about getting Mom through the accident, getting her through the ICU, getting her through the ventilator, getting her through the hospital, getting her stronger. That was what I was focused on. Now I had to start thinking about her life after all of that. And this is where I started to feel even more like the wicked daughter. Because caregiving isn't just making medical decisions. It's not just keeping track of medications. It's not just talking to doctors. Sometimes you become the person who has to push your parent to do the things that will help them recover. Come on, Mom, do your exercises. Let's try again. Take another bite. You can hold the fork. Let's try and brush your teeth. And they don't necessarily want to. Sometimes they're tired. Sometimes they're frustrated. Sometimes they're scared. And sometimes they're just sick and tired of being told what to do. And honestly, I get it. If I were lying in a hospital bed and somebody kept telling me to do one more exercise, I'd probably want to throw the exercise equipment at them. But that's the job. And that's the line caregivers walk all the time. Am I encouraging her? Or am I pushing too hard? Am I helping? Or am I taking over? Do I give her another 5 minutes? Or do I let her rest? Do I tell her she needs to try again? Or do I say, okay, you've done enough today? There is no handbook for that. And the line moves constantly. Some days I pushed a little harder. Other days I backed off. And sometimes I had absolutely no idea if I was getting it right or wrong. That's where I was, trying to help Mom get stronger, while trying not to take away the little control she still had. And I was learning that those two things don't always go together. Back home, Dave and I were starting to have some very difficult conversations. We knew Mom wasn't going to be ready to go home and live independently. We were looking at long-term care facilities. We knew she wasn't ready for full-scale rehab yet. We were trying to figure out what made sense for the next stage. And then Dave said, "Why don't we have Mom live with us?" Wait, what? I hadn't asked him to do that. He just offered. I was stunned. Because apparently my husband had decided that adding an 88-year-old recovering trauma patient to our household was a reasonable solution. And honestly, thank God he did. Because I had been carrying that decision around almost entirely by myself. And suddenly, I didn't have to. He wasn't saying this is what we're doing forever. He was saying, let's bring her home with us while she recovers. Then we'll figure out what's next. And that was exactly what I needed to hear. Because we didn't know what Mom would be capable of once she finished rehab. We didn't know how much help she'd need. We didn't know whether she'd eventually be able to live independently again. We just knew she needed somewhere safe to go while she recovered. And I don't think Dave knows how much pressure that took off my shoulders. Because this wasn't a small thing he was offering. Dave and I had both been married before. By the time we met, our kids were grown and living on their own. Honestly, I think that made our relationship easier. It was just the two of us. Less chaos, less negotiating, fewer people to worry about. And then there was my mom. From the beginning, I'd been very clear with Dave. My mom was important to me. And so was my dog. I'm pretty sure my dating requirements were basically must love dogs, must understand my mom is not optional. Luckily, he signed up anyway. Mom had always been independent. I'd always hoped that if the day came when she needed me, I'd be able to be there. I knew somewhere in the back of my mind that someday Mom and I might have to make some pretty big decisions together. You know that call I talked about back in episode 2? The one you wait for and hope never comes? You know it's possible. You just don't let yourself visualize what comes after it. Until suddenly, you're sitting in a hospital trying to figure out what happens next. Not because you planned for this, because apparently life has other plans. And of course, there's no handbook for the version of life you're suddenly living. And the life Dave and I had built? Well, it wasn't exactly set up for this. 3 years earlier, we had sold our condo. We'd started sailing the eastern seaboard and the Bahamas. We were snowbirds. We'd built a pretty mobile life. And here's the part I don't think adult children always say out loud. We knew this day might come. We knew Mom was getting older. We knew there might eventually be a time when she needed more from us. And we'd actually talked about this. All 3 of us. Mom didn't want us sitting around waiting for something that might happen years from now. She wanted us to live our lives too. And honestly, we wanted that. We wanted to travel before we were tired, while we were still young enough and healthy enough to do the things we wanted to do. Because none of us knows how much time we have. We didn't want to wait for Mom to die before we started traveling. That sounds harsh, but it wasn't. It was something we had actually talked about together. We were trying to find a way to live our lives while Mom was still living hers. And we'd already started adjusting that life around Mom. After she broke her collarbone and later badly bruised her ribs in another fall, we started thinking differently about how far away we can realistically be. Eventually, we sold the boat and bought an RV. The idea was simple. We could keep traveling, but would be able to get back to Florida quicker if Mom needed us. We just didn't expect to need the backup plan quite so soon. Last year, when Mom was hospitalized with COVID and then went to rehab, my sister came down to help with Mom first. I flew home afterwards to help get her settled before heading back west. We thought we'd figured it out. We could have our life and still be close enough to Mom when she needed us. We were planning to spend the winter in South Florida and then head back out to travel for the summer and fall. We'd just gotten back to South Florida when Mom was hit by the car. So much for our travel plans. We'd been in South Florida for about a week, and suddenly, everything had changed. And if you're listening to this thinking, wait a minute, what happened to the life I had planned? I want you to know I asked myself the same question. Because people talk about caregiving, but so much of the conversation happens after the fact. Not enough, I think, is said about what it's like when your life is changing in real time. Caregiving just doesn't change your parents' life. It can change your life, your schedule, your home, your finances, your marriage, your plans, your freedom. Sometimes you don't even realize how much has changed until you're standing in the middle of it. And you're thinking, when exactly did this become my life? I didn't have an answer. I just knew things were changing. And if you're sitting there thinking, yup, this is my life too, that's exactly why I created this podcast. Because there are plenty of places to find information about caring for an aging parent. But sometimes you don't need another checklist. You just need to know somebody else gets it. If The Wicked Daughter has become that place for you, hit follow so you don't miss the next episode. And if you want to help me keep making these episodes, you can support the show through Buy Me a Coffee. There's a link right in the podcast description. And if you can't or don't want to contribute financially, that's completely okay. Sharing an episode or telling another caregiver about the show helps more than you know. Okay, back to the story. We started looking for a house. Not because we decided what the rest of our lives were going to look like. We needed a place where Mom could recover. A place where we can keep her close to her friends, close to the activities she loved, close enough that she can still have some connection to the life she'd built. And then there was the other part. We had to pack Mom's condo, the home she'd lived in for 37 years. 37 years. Think about that. If you're a child who's ever had to clean out a parent's home, you know. You're not just packing boxes. You're opening drawers you haven't opened before. You're finding things you forgot existed. You're deciding what stays, what goes, what gets donated, what gets thrown away. And every object seems to come with a story. Mom wasn't packing for a move she had planned. I was packing up the home she'd expected to grow old in. That part was hard. Because somewhere between the boxes, the paperwork, the decisions, and trying to figure out what came next, it really hit me. We weren't planning Mom's return to her old life. We were trying to build a new one. For her, for Dave, for me, for all of us. And I wasn't sure what that life was going to look like. Honestly, this was around the time the exhaustion really started catching up with me. I'd been running on adrenaline for weeks. Hospital, ICU, step down, back to ICU, acute care hospital, decisions, research, paperwork, phone calls, and now, a house. Packing Mom's entire life. Trying to figure out where we'd live. Trying to figure out what she could do. Trying to figure out what I could do. And I was reaching the point where I couldn't keep going at the pace I'd been going. Maybe you've been there. Everyone is telling you, you're doing such a great job. And you're thinking, thank you. I would like to resign. Because loving someone doesn't make you tireless. It doesn't give you unlimited patience. It doesn't mean you never get angry. It doesn't mean you never want 5 minutes where nobody needs anything from you. It just means you keep showing up. Even when you're exhausted. Even when you're frustrated. Even when you're not sure you're doing it right. That's what I was learning. Getting Mom better was only the beginning. The real question wasn't, could we get her through this? We were already doing that. The question was, what would life look like after this? And for the first time, I understood that there might not be a way to go back to the life we'd had before. We were going to have to build something new. We just didn't know what it looked like yet. And that's another thing caregivers learn the hard way. Sometimes you just make the next plan. Then the next one. And then you see what happens. That's what we were doing. One decision at a time. One day at a time. And as usual, caregiving had changed the question before I even had an answer. I didn't have a 5-year plan. Hell, I barely had a 5-day plan. But we had a next step. And for now, that was enough. Around here, we're calling that a win. Until next time, take care of yourself too.
When your friends say cherish this time, you smile while you're losing your mind. Was it the pharmacy line or the rush hour doctor drive? So you swallow that glare with a laugh and a sigh and say, don't fret, dear. We're having the time of our lives. Oh, we're having the time of our lives. Wicked daughter.